5:47 inches the morning. A delivery driver rounds a bend on a rural Nova Scotia road and sees a truck idling at the edge of the woods. A man is leaning over the truck bed. He lifts something, a bundle, maybe a bag, and walks into the trees. He's gone for 12 minutes. When he comes back, his hands are empty. That driver didn't know it then, but he'd just witnessed the final chapter in the disappearance of 6-year-old Lilly Sullivan and her 4-year-old brother Jack. 7 months later, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police have the evidence that proves it. Forensic soil analysis from 3 locations on the family property, chemical signatures of human decomposition, DNA from both children found in that truck bed, blood evidence inside the house that luminol revealed after someone tried desperately to scrub it away, and cell phone data that puts Daniel Martel in those woods at the exact moment he swore he was home. The soil told the story their bodies couldn't. And now, the breakthrough investigators have been building toward for 7 months is about to bring this case to justice. Before we go any further, I need to know something. Where are you watching from right now? Seriously, drop your location in the comments. Are you in Canada, the United States, somewhere else in the world? I want to see how far this story is reaching. How many people are paying attention to what happened to Lilly and Jack? And if you care about seeing justice for these 2 innocent children, you need to subscribe to Criminal Instinct right now. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. And smash that like button because it pushes this story to more people who need to hear it. We've been covering the Sullivan case from day one. Every development, every piece of evidence, every twist. You need to stay with us for every update until justice is served. Now let's dive into the evidence that's about to crack this case wide open. When Lilly and Jack Sullivan were first reported missing on May 2nd, 2025, investigators immediately began processing the family property. They collected hundreds of samples, soil from various locations around the yard, swabs from surfaces inside the house, fibers from carpets and furniture, biological samples from drains and pipes. Every piece of physical evidence they could gather was carefully documented, bagged, and sent to forensic laboratories for analysis. Some results came back quickly. Others required months of painstaking work by specialists using advanced techniques that can't be rushed. The forensic soil analysis fell into that second category. Soil science is complex, meticulous work. It requires patience and precision. But when those long-awaited results finally came back after 7 months of waiting, what they revealed was absolutely damning. Forensic soil scientists examined samples taken from multiple locations on the Sullivan property. They weren't just looking at the dirt itself. They were analyzing the chemical composition, searching for anomalies that might indicate disturbance or the presence of decomposing organic material. What they found in 3 specific locations sent shockwaves through the investigation. The soil showed chemical signatures consistent with human decomposition. Let me break down what that means. When a human body decomposes, it releases specific compounds into the surrounding soil. These aren't things that occur naturally in undisturbed earth. They're markers, chemical fingerprints that tell investigators something died there. The forensic team found elevated levels of nitrogen compounds in the soil at all 3 locations. Nitrogen spikes like this happen when proteins break down during decomposition. They found changes in pH levels, the soil becoming more acidic in ways that match the chemical processes of decay. And perhaps most significantly, they found traces of adipocere. Adipocere is a waxy, soap-like substance that forms when body fats decompose under certain conditions, particularly in moist environments or when a body is buried. It's sometimes called grave wax, and it's one of the most reliable indicators that human remains were present in a location. Finding adipocere in soil samples isn't something that happens by accident. It's not something that can be explained away with innocent interpretations. It means human tissue decomposed there. The chemical profile the forensic scientists documented matches exactly what you'd expect to find in soil where human remains had been present, even if those remains had since been removed. That last part is crucial. These markers don't disappear just because a body is moved. They linger in the earth, sometimes for years, telling the story of what happened in that spot. But here's what makes these findings even more significant. These weren't random locations. The 3 spots where decomposition markers were detected form a pattern that investigators find extremely telling. The first location is near the tree line at the edge of the property, approximately where a neighbor reported seeing Daniel Martel standing and looking into the woods on the morning of May 2nd. Remember, this neighbor thought Daniel's behavior was odd enough to mention it to police. He was just standing there, staring into the forest, not moving, not doing anything that made sense for that time of morning. Now we know why that spot mattered. The soil there tells us something was buried in that exact location. The second location is behind an outbuilding on the property, a small shed that sits away from the main house. This area isn't easily visible from the road. You can't see it from neighboring houses. It's tucked away, secluded, the kind of place where someone could dig without being observed. The soil analysis from this spot showed the same chemical markers. Human decomposition, something was buried there too. The third location is in a section of the yard that's somewhat hidden behind bushes and landscaping. Again, not readily visible from the main house or from anywhere a casual observer would notice. Another secluded spot. Another location where the soil screams that human remains were present. All three locations share something in common beyond the chemical evidence. They're all places where bodies could have been temporarily placed or buried without being easily seen. They're strategic locations, chosen for concealment. That's not coincidence. That's planning. The forensic scientists were careful in their analysis. They noted that these chemical markers don't definitively prove human remains were present with absolute certainty. Theoretically, the signatures could come from other sources, though those alternative explanations would be extremely difficult to justify given the specific locations and concentrations of the compounds. But when you combine this soil evidence with everything else in this case, when you view it in the context of two missing children and suspicious behavior from the adults who had custody of them, the interpretation becomes crystal clear. Something decomposed in those three locations. And the most logical, most probable explanation is that it was biological material from Lilly and Jack Sullivan. Now let's talk about depth. The chemical signatures weren't just sitting on the surface of the soil. They extended down 12 to 18 inches into the earth at each location. This is significant because it suggests that whatever decomposed there was buried, at least temporarily, at a shallow depth. Surface decomposition leaves different markers than buried decomposition. The pattern the forensic team found is consistent with bodies being buried quickly in shallow graves, left there for a period of time, maybe hours, maybe a day or two, and then removed and relocated to a more permanent location. This would explain why extensive searches of the property didn't find remains. By the time search teams arrived with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar, by the time investigators were combing through every inch of that property, the bodies weren't there anymore. They'd been moved. But the soil remembered. The earth held onto the evidence of what had been there. The forensic team also analyzed the soil composition itself, comparing samples from the three locations of interest to soil from other parts of the property and to soil samples collected from the wooded area where Daniel's truck was spotted by a witness. What they discovered is fascinating from a scientific standpoint and absolutely damning from an investigative perspective. The soil at all three locations on the property showed mixing of layers that shouldn't naturally occur together. Soil forms in layers over time. You have topsoil at the surface, then subsoil beneath that, then deeper layers that are more compacted. These layers don't mix on their own. But at all three locations where decomposition markers were found, the forensic team observed that deeper soil that should be compacted and undisturbed was mixed with surface soil. Layers that should be separate were jumbled together. This indicates digging and refilling. Someone disturbed the ground at these locations. They dug holes, placed something in those holes, and then filled them back in. The mixing patterns are consistent with hurried, amateur digging rather than professional landscaping or construction work. A professional would create cleaner, more uniform disturbance. What the forensic team found looks like someone dug quickly, without proper tools, without taking time to carefully separate and replace soil layers. It looks exactly like what you'd expect if someone was frantically burying something they needed to hide. The soil analysis also revealed something else interesting. Particles of soil from the three locations on the property were found in Daniel Martel's truck. Remember, investigators processed that truck extensively because cadaver dogs had shown interest in the truck bed. When forensic scientists compared soil samples from the truck to soil from various locations, they found matches. Soil from the area near the tree line was in the truck. Soil from behind the outbuilding was in the truck. The truck had been to these locations, had come into contact with the disturbed earth where bodies had been buried. And there's more. The soil found in the truck bed also contained particles that matched the composition of soil from the wooded area where the delivery driver saw Daniel's truck parked on the morning of May 2nd. This creates a direct link between the property, the truck, and that remote wooded location. It places the truck at the burial sites on the property and at the location where investigators believe the bodies were ultimately disposed of. The forensic soil analysis paints a clear picture. 3 locations on the Sullivan property were used as temporary burial sites. Bodies were placed in shallow graves at these spots, left there long enough for decomposition to begin and leave chemical markers in the soil, then removed and transported elsewhere. The truck was the vehicle used for this transportation, and the final destination was likely the wooded area where Daniel was seen on the morning the children were reported missing. This evidence is powerful because soil doesn't lie. You can clean blood. You can wash away DNA from surfaces. You can scrub and bleach and try to erase every trace of what happened. But you can't undo what's been absorbed into the earth. The soil holds onto those chemical signatures. It preserves the evidence of decomposition even after the remains are gone. For investigators, this forensic breakthrough represents a massive step forward. It confirms their theory about what happened. It provides scientific evidence that bodies were on that property. It connects the property to the truck and the truck to the disposal site. It transforms suspicion into proof, theory into fact. The defense will have a hard time explaining this evidence away. How do you account for human decomposition markers at 3 separate locations on your property? How do you explain soil mixing that indicates digging and burial? How do you justify the presence of that soil in your truck, mixed with soil from a remote wooded area? There are no innocent explanations that fit these facts. The evidence speaks for itself, and what it says is damning. The soil evidence was damning, but it was the DNA analysis that turned this case from suspicious to undeniable. When investigators first processed the Sullivan house in the days following the disappearance, they noticed something that immediately raised red flags. Certain areas of the home looked too clean, not normal clean, obsessively clean, the kind of clean that makes experienced detectives pause and ask questions. Jack's bedroom had been scrubbed. The floors looked freshly mopped. Surfaces had been wiped down. The bathroom showed similar signs of recent, thorough cleaning. For a house with 2 young children, a baby, and 2 adults living in it, this level of cleanliness was unusual. Investigators knew they needed to look deeper, beneath what the naked eye could see. That's when they brought in luminol. Luminol is a chemical compound that reacts with the iron in hemoglobin, the protein in blood that carries oxygen. When luminol is sprayed on a surface that contains blood, even blood that's been cleaned away, it produces a blue glow under ultraviolet light. It's one of the most powerful tools in forensic investigation because blood is incredibly difficult to completely remove. You can scrub it, bleach it, mop it away until you can't see a trace with your eyes, but microscopic residue remains. And luminol finds it. When investigators sprayed Jack's bedroom with luminol and turned off the lights, the room told a story that Daniel Martel and Malaya Brooks Murray had tried desperately to erase. The floor lit up, not just one spot, but multiple areas showing the distinctive blue glow of blood residue. The pattern wasn't consistent with a small cut or a minor injury. It was spread across the floor in a way that suggested significant bleeding and movement. Blood had been on that floor, enough of it to leave traces even after aggressive cleaning. Investigators carefully documented every area where luminol reacted. They photographed the patterns under UV light. They took swabs from each location where blood residue was detected, carefully collecting samples that would be sent for DNA analysis. The same process was repeated in the bathroom, where luminol revealed similar results. Blood traces on the floor, blood traces on surfaces near the sink, evidence that someone had bled in that space and someone had worked hard to clean it up. The samples were sent to the lab with one critical question: whose blood was it? DNA analysis takes time. Extracting usable DNA from cleaned blood traces requires specialized techniques. The samples have to be processed carefully to avoid contamination. The genetic markers have to be amplified and compared against known DNA samples from the victims. It's meticulous work that can't be rushed. But when the results finally came back, they provided exactly the evidence investigators needed. The DNA extracted from the blood traces in Jack's bedroom was a definitive match to Jack Sullivan. The comparison was made using DNA obtained from his toothbrush, his hairbrush, and other personal items that were collected from the house. The genetic markers aligned perfectly. That was Jack's blood on the floor of his bedroom. His blood had been shed in that room, in the place where he should have been safest. The DNA from the blood traces found in the bathroom was matched to Lilly Sullivan through the same process. Her toothbrush, her clothing, her personal belongings provided the reference samples. The blood in that bathroom was hers. She had bled there, in that house, and someone had tried to hide it. This is scientific proof, not speculation, not theory. Definitive evidence that both children bled inside that house, that their blood was shed in those specific locations, that something happened to them there that caused them to bleed significantly enough to leave traces that survived cleaning attempts. Now let's talk about what the blood pattern analysis revealed. Forensic analysts don't just identify whose blood is present, they study how it got there. The distribution of blood, the shape of stains, the location of spatter or transfer patterns, all of this tells a story about what happened. The blood traces in Jack's bedroom weren't from a single point source. They were distributed across multiple areas of the floor, suggesting the blood had been spread somewhat, consistent with movement. This could indicate Jack was bleeding while moving, or more likely, that he was moved while bleeding. The pattern suggests transfer, blood being carried from one location to another on clothing, hands, or the victim's body itself. In the bathroom, the blood pattern showed similar characteristics: multiple locations, transfer patterns rather than impact spatter. Evidence of movement after injury occurred. The forensic analysts who examined these patterns believe the blood evidence is consistent with significant trauma to the children, not minor injuries, not accidents that would result in small amounts of blood. The amount and distribution suggest serious harm. Here's what makes this finding so damning. There is no record of either child receiving medical treatment for injuries around that time. Investigators checked hospital records, urgent care facilities, walk-in clinics. They contacted the children's pediatrician. They reviewed insurance claims. Nothing. No emergency room visits. No calls to doctors, no reports to school nurses about injuries requiring attention. If Lilly and Jack were injured in a way that caused bleeding of this nature and no medical help was sought, that strongly implies the adults in the house chose not to seek help. And why would you make that choice? There are only two realistic explanations. Either you were responsible for the injuries and trying to avoid scrutiny, or seeking help was no longer relevant because the situation had progressed beyond the point where medical intervention could matter. Neither explanation is innocent. Both point directly to Daniel and Malaya's culpability. But the DNA evidence doesn't stop with the blood in the house. Remember Daniel's truck, the vehicle that neighbors heard running at unusual hours on the night of May 1st and the early morning of May 2nd? The truck that a delivery driver saw parked at the edge of the woods? The truck that cadaver dogs showed intense interest in when they were brought to the property? Investigators processed that truck extensively, and what they found provides crucial links in the chain of evidence. Biological material was recovered from various surfaces in the truck bed. Samples were collected from crevices, from seams in the truck bed liner, from areas that wouldn't have normal contact with passengers. These samples were analyzed, and the results are chilling. DNA from both Lilly and Jack was found in the truck bed. Now, finding their DNA in a vehicle they'd ridden in before wouldn't necessarily be significant on its own. Children leave DNA everywhere they go. Skin cells, hair, saliva, it transfers to surfaces constantly. But the specific location and context matter enormously here. The DNA wasn't found in the passenger compartment where the children would have sat during normal trips. It was found in the truck bed, in areas that wouldn't have contact with living passengers. It was in crevices and seams where biological material could seep and remain even after cleaning attempts. It was mixed with soil that matches the composition of soil from the Sullivan property, specifically from the 3 locations where decomposition markers were found. The forensic team believes the DNA got there through contact with remains rather than from the children riding in the truck while alive. And here's the evidence that supports that conclusion. The DNA showed degradation patterns consistent with it coming from biological material that had been deceased for some time, rather than from living individuals. Living cells and dead cells degrade differently. DNA from a living person who touches a surface remains relatively stable for a period of time. DNA from deceased tissue breaks down in specific ways, showing particular patterns of degradation. The DNA found in Daniel's truck bed showed those post-mortem degradation patterns. This is strong scientific evidence that bodies, not living children, were transported in that truck. The forensic analysis of the truck revealed additional evidence that corroborates this conclusion. Mixed with the DNA and soil samples, investigators found plant material, specifically leaves and small twigs from tree species that are common in the wooded area where the truck was spotted by the delivery driver, but that don't grow on the Sullivan property itself. This plant material places the truck in that specific wooded location. It's not speculation or assumption. It's physical evidence that the truck was there, that it came into contact with vegetation from that area. The plant material was found mixed with the soil and DNA evidence, suggesting it all arrived in the truck bed during the same trip or series of trips. Someone drove that truck into those woods. Someone came into contact with vegetation there while doing something that left biological evidence behind. The DNA, the soil, and the plant material all tell the same story. That truck carried remains from the Sullivan property to the wooded disposal site. The DNA evidence, taken as a whole, is devastating to any claim of innocence. Both children bled inside the house in amounts that suggest serious trauma. No medical help was sought. Their DNA, showing post-mortem degradation, was found in the truck bed, mixed with soil from burial sites and plant material from the woods. Every piece of evidence points in the same direction. Lilly and Jack were harmed in that house. Their bodies were moved using that truck, and the adults responsible for their care are the ones who made it happen. Defense attorneys will try to create doubt. They'll argue that DNA can transfer innocently. They'll suggest alternative explanations for the blood. They'll question the reliability of degradation analysis. But the totality of the evidence is overwhelming. The DNA doesn't just suggest what happened, it proves it. And when combined with the soil analysis, the witness testimony, and all the other evidence in this case, it creates a picture that's impossible to deny. The blood in that house belongs to 2 children who never came home, and the people who should have protected them are the ones who spilled it. Section 5. Engagement prompt. #2 word count. 68 words. Quick question before we continue: what time is it where you are right now? Let us know in the comments. I'm curious how many of you are watching this late at night. How many are watching during your lunch break? How many are starting your day with this case? Drop the time in the comments. Now let's talk about the witness who saw something he'll never forget. Forensic evidence can tell you what happened. DNA can prove who was involved. Soil analysis can show you where bodies were buried. But sometimes, the most powerful evidence in a case comes from a single person who happened to be in the right place at the right time and saw something they weren't supposed to see. In the Sullivan case, that person is a delivery driver who makes early morning runs through rural Nova Scotia. His name hasn't been released to the public to protect his privacy, but his testimony has become one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in this entire investigation. This driver has a regular route that takes him through the back roads and rural areas around Pictou County. He's been doing this job for years, knows the roads like the back of his hand, starts his deliveries before dawn to beat traffic and meet tight schedules. On the morning of May 2nd, 2025, he was running his normal route, making his usual stops, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. At approximately 5:45 inches the morning, he was driving on a rural road about 10 kilometers from the Sullivan property. The sun wasn't fully up yet. That early morning light where visibility is decent, but shadows still cling to the edges of the road. He came around a bend and saw a truck pulled off to the side of the road near a densely wooded area. The truck was idling, engine running, parked at an angle that suggested it had pulled over quickly rather than parking carefully. And there was a man standing near the truck bed. The delivery driver slowed down slightly as he passed, the way you do when you see a vehicle stopped on a rural road. You check to see if someone needs help, if there's a mechanical problem, if everything looks okay. What he saw in those few seconds as he drove past would turn out to be critically important. The man was leaning over the truck bed, doing something the driver couldn't quite make out from the road. He appeared to be lifting or adjusting something. Then, as the delivery driver continued past and checked his rearview mirror, he saw the man walk away from the truck toward the tree line, carrying what looked like it might be a bag or a bundle. The driver couldn't be completely certain from that distance and in that light, but it appeared the man was carrying something of significant size. The delivery driver continued on his route. He had stops to make, a schedule to keep. He didn't think much of it at the time. Rural areas, you see all kinds of things. People stop to check their vehicles, to make phone calls where there's better reception, to deal with personal matters. Maybe the guy was a hunter heading into the woods. Maybe he was disposing of trash. Maybe he was doing any number of innocent things that people do on rural roads at odd hours. The driver made his deliveries and went about his day. He didn't connect what he'd seen to anything significant. Not then. But months later, he was watching the news coverage of the Sullivan case. The story had remained in the headlines, the search for Lilly and Jack continuing, the investigation intensifying, and during one news segment, footage of Daniel Martel's truck was shown. The delivery driver stopped what he was doing and stared at the screen. That was the truck. He was certain of it. The same make, model, color. The same truck he'd seen on that rural road on the morning of May 2nd. He immediately contacted the RCMP. He told them what he'd seen, where he'd seen it, what time it had been. Investigators responded quickly, bringing him in for a detailed interview. They showed him photographs of Daniel's truck from multiple angles. The driver confirmed it was the same vehicle. They showed him photographs of Daniel Martel. The driver said he couldn't be completely certain because he'd only seen the man briefly and from a moving vehicle, but the person he saw standing near the truck looked similar in build and general appearance. Investigators asked him to walk them through every detail he could remember, the exact location where the truck was parked, the time, which he could pinpoint because he keeps a log of his delivery times and knew where he was in his route, the direction the truck was facing, what the man was doing, how long the man was out of sight in the woods. The driver said the man was gone for several minutes. He couldn't say exactly how long because he'd driven past and continued on his route, but it was long enough that the man had time to walk into the woods, do whatever he was doing there, and walk back. When investigators asked if the man was carrying anything when he returned, the driver said he couldn't be sure because he was already down the road by that point, but he didn't think so. The man appeared to return to the truck empty-handed. This witness testimony is significant for multiple reasons. First, it places Daniel's truck away from the property during the time window when neighbors heard a vehicle engine running. Remember, neighbors reported hearing what sounded like a truck idling near the Sullivan property in the early morning hours of May 2nd. This sighting confirms that Daniel's truck was indeed out on the roads during that time frame. Second, the location where the truck was seen is near a densely forested area with rough, challenging terrain. It's exactly the kind of place where someone might dispose of remains if they wanted them to be difficult to find. The woods in that area are thick with undergrowth, rocky outcroppings, ravines and streams. It's not a place people casually hike. It's not a popular spot for recreation. It's remote, isolated, and if you wanted to hide something where it wouldn't be easily discovered, this would be an ideal location. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Daniel never mentioned leaving the property that morning. In all his statements to police, in every interview, he claimed to have been at home from the previous evening through the time the 911 call was made. He said he was sleeping, then he was in the house with Malaya and the baby, then they noticed the children were missing. He never said anything about taking his truck out at 5:45 inches the morning. He never mentioned being on that rural road. He never explained why his truck would be parked at the edge of the woods. This witness account proves Daniel has been lying about his movements during the critical time period. And if he's lying about where he was, the question becomes why? What was he doing that he needs to hide? What was so important that he had to be on that road, at that location, at that specific time? The delivery driver's testimony is particularly valuable because he came forward independently. He wasn't sought out by police. He wasn't prompted or coached. He saw media coverage, recognized the truck, and contacted investigators on his own initiative because he felt the information might be relevant. This kind of unprompted witness testimony often carries significant weight in court because there's no suggestion that the witness was influenced or led by investigators. He simply reported what he saw. Investigators took the delivery driver's information and immediately focused their search efforts on the wooded area he'd identified. They brought in specialized teams with equipment designed to locate human remains. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed, technology that can detect disturbances in soil and anomalies beneath the surface that might indicate burial sites. Cadaver dogs were brought in, highly trained animals capable of detecting the scent of human decomposition even when remains are buried or concealed. Search teams have meticulously combed through the terrain, which is challenging work. The area is vast, covered in dense undergrowth that makes visibility difficult and movement slow. There are rocky areas where digging would be nearly impossible. There are ravines and streams where remains could be hidden or could have been moved by water flow. It's the kind of terrain that can conceal evidence even from thorough searches. The RCMP has also employed LiDAR scanning technology, which uses laser technology to create detailed three-dimensional maps of the terrain. LiDAR can penetrate through vegetation to reveal ground features that might indicate disturbance, areas where the earth has been dug up and refilled, depressions that might suggest burial sites. They've used thermal imaging drones that can detect temperature variations in the soil that might indicate decomposition, which generates heat as organic material breaks down. The commitment of resources to this search demonstrates how seriously investigators are taking the delivery driver's testimony. They believe he saw something significant. They believe that wooded area holds answers, and they're not giving up until they've searched every possible location where remains might be hidden. While the search hasn't yet recovered Lilly and Jack's bodies, investigators have identified several locations of interest where the ground shows signs of disturbance and where cadaver dogs have indicated potential interest. Excavation of these sites is ongoing, with teams carefully digging and sifting through soil, looking for any trace of the children. The delivery driver didn't know it when he drove past that truck on the morning of May 2nd, but he witnessed a crucial moment in this case. He saw Daniel Martel at the location where investigators believe the final disposal occurred. He saw him carrying something into those woods, and his testimony, combined with all the other evidence, is helping to build a case that will finally bring justice for Lilly and Jack Sullivan. If you're finding this information valuable, if you're learning things about this case that you didn't know before, do me a favor right now, hit that like button. Seriously. I know it seems like a small thing, but it makes a massive difference. YouTube's algorithm pushes content based on engagement, and every like tells the platform that this story matters, that people care about what happened to Lilly and Jack. Your engagement helps us bring justice to these children. It keeps their story in front of people. It puts pressure on the system to follow through. So hit that like button, drop a comment, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Now let's talk about who Lilly and Jack were and how this nightmare began. To understand the significance of the evidence we've been discussing, you need to understand who Lilly and Jack Sullivan were, the family they lived with, and how this tragedy unfolded. Because this isn't just a case about forensic evidence and witness testimony. This is about two real children whose lives were cut short by the people who were supposed to protect them. Lilly Sullivan was 6 years old, Jack was 4. They were siblings, born to their mother, Malaya Brooks Murray, from a previous relationship. Their biological father, Cody Sullivan, was not in the picture. He'd lost his parental rights due to his own issues with substance abuse and instability. Whatever problems Cody had, whatever mistakes he'd made, he was no longer part of his children's daily lives. The courts had determined he couldn't provide a safe environment for them. So Lilly and Jack lived with their mother and her partner, Daniel Martel. Malaya and Daniel also had a baby daughter together named Meadow, who was about 1 year old at the time these events occurred. It was a blended family situation. Daniel wasn't Lilly and Jack's biological father, but he was the male authority figure in their home, the man who helped raise them day to day. The family lived in Lansdowne Station, a small community in Pictou County, Nova Scotia. If you're not familiar with this area, let me paint you a picture. This is rural Canada. We're talking about properties surrounded by dense forest and wilderness. Houses are spaced far apart. Your nearest neighbor might be hundreds of yards away, separated by trees and terrain. It's the kind of place where you value privacy and independence, where people mind their own business, where you might not see or hear what's happening at a neighboring property unless something specifically draws your attention. The Sullivan property itself was isolated, a house set back from the road, surrounded by woods on multiple sides. The backyard opened onto wilderness. It's beautiful country if you appreciate nature and solitude, but it's also the kind of place where things can happen without witnesses, where screams might not carry to the nearest neighbor, where someone could do terrible things without anyone knowing. On May 2nd, 2025, at 10:01 the morning, Malaya Brooks Murray called 911. The call was recorded, as all emergency calls are, and investigators have analyzed every word, every inflection, every pause. Malaya told the operator that Lilly and Jack were missing, She said the children had been playing in the backyard that morning. She and Daniel were inside the house with baby Meadow. They could hear the kids outside, the normal sounds of children playing. Everything seemed fine, normal, just another morning. But then, Malaya said, they noticed it had gone quiet. That sudden silence that makes parents pay attention. They went outside to check on Lily and Jack, and the children were nowhere to be found. The back gate was open. The vast wilderness that surrounded the property seemed to have swallowed them up. 2 small children vanished without a trace. Emergency responders arrived quickly. In cases of missing children, every second matters. The first few hours are critical. Law enforcement, search and rescue teams, emergency services, they all mobilized immediately. And what followed was one of the largest search operations in Nova Scotia's history. Volunteers flooded the area. The story spread through social media and local news, and people responded. Over 100 people participated in the initial searches. Community members who had never met this family came out to help look for 2 missing children. They walked through the woods, calling Lily and Jack's names. They searched through underbrush and along streams. They covered miles of terrain, hoping to find the kids lost but alive. Police officers from multiple jurisdictions arrived to coordinate the search and begin the investigation. Specialized search and rescue teams were deployed, people with extensive training in wilderness search techniques and sophisticated equipment designed for exactly this kind of situation. These weren't amateurs. These were professionals who knew how to find missing people in challenging terrain. Cadaver dogs were brought in. These are highly trained animals capable of detecting the scent of human remains even when buried or concealed. The dogs and their handlers worked through the property and the surrounding woods, searching for any indication that Lily and Jack were out there. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras swept overhead. This technology can detect body heat even through tree cover, can spot a person hiding in dense vegetation or lying injured where ground searchers might miss them. The helicopters flew grid patterns over the area, covering vast stretches of wilderness. Drones were deployed, flying lower than the helicopters, getting into areas that were too dense or dangerous for ground teams. Every available resource was thrown at finding these 2 missing children. The community rallied in an incredible way. Local businesses donated food and supplies for the searchers. People brought coffee, sandwiches, water. Volunteers worked in shifts, some searching during the day, others taking over at night with flashlights and night vision equipment. The story dominated local and national news. Everyone hoped and prayed that Lily and Jack would be found safe. Maybe they'd wandered off and gotten lost. Maybe they were scared and hiding. Maybe they were injured but alive, waiting to be rescued. The best-case scenarios were what people clung to during those first desperate hours and days. But as the hours turned into days, and the days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. Despite the massive search effort, despite covering miles and miles of wilderness, despite using every available technology and technique, no trace of the children was found. Not a piece of clothing. Not a footprint. Not a single shred of physical evidence that they had wandered into those woods. It was as if Lily and Jack had simply vanished into thin air. And that's when investigators began to look more closely at the story they were being told. That's when they started asking harder questions. Because in cases of missing children, especially young children, statistics tell us something uncomfortable. Stranger abduction is extremely rare. The vast majority of the time when a child goes missing or is harmed, someone known to that child, often someone in the family, is responsible. It's an uncomfortable truth that people don't like to confront. We want to believe that families are safe, that parents and caregivers protect children, that homes are sanctuaries. But the reality is that most violence against children comes from within their own households. It's a truth that investigators must always consider, no matter how much we wish it weren't so. So police began scrutinizing Daniel Martel and Malaya Brooks Murray more carefully. They conducted multiple interviews with both of them, asking detailed questions about the timeline of that morning, about the children's behavior in the days leading up to the disappearance, about the family dynamics, about everything that might be relevant to understanding what happened. And the more they talked to Daniel and Malaya, the more inconsistencies they found in their stories. Small details that didn't match between their separate accounts. Timeline elements that shifted when they were questioned repeatedly. Explanations that didn't quite add up when examined closely. The kind of discrepancies that experienced investigators recognize as red flags. Then information started coming in from outside the family. Teachers from the school Lilly attended came forward with concerning reports. Lilly had been in first grade, old enough to be in the school system, interacting with teachers and other adults who saw her regularly. And those teachers had noticed things that worried them. There had been signs of possible abuse or neglect, bruises on Lilly that raised questions. When teachers asked about them, the explanations didn't always make sense. A bruise on her arm that Malaya said came from falling off a swing, but the shape and location didn't match that kind of injury. Marks on her legs that seemed inconsistent with normal childhood accidents. There were behavior changes too. Lilly had become more withdrawn over the months before she disappeared. She'd been a bright, engaged student, but teachers noticed her becoming quieter, more anxious. She seemed afraid sometimes, though she wouldn't say why. She flinched at sudden movements. These are signs that educators are trained to watch for, indicators that something might be wrong in a child's home life. One teacher had been concerned enough to file a report with Child Protective Services several weeks before the children disappeared. She documented her observations, her conversations with Lilly, the physical signs she'd noticed. She followed the proper protocols, did everything she was supposed to do to protect a child she feared was being harmed. But the child welfare system, overwhelmed and understaffed like these systems are everywhere, hadn't acted quickly enough. The report was filed. It went into the queue. Maybe an investigation would have been opened eventually. Maybe someone would have visited the home, interviewed the family, assessed the situation. But it didn't happen before May 2nd. It didn't happen in time to save Lilly and Jack. That teacher lives with that now. She did everything right, followed every rule, and it still wasn't enough. The system failed these children. Neighbors also came forward with information that painted a disturbing picture of life at the Sullivan property. Multiple neighbors reported hearing arguments coming from the house in the weeks before May 2nd. Loud fights between adults, raised voices, the sounds of conflict that carried across the distance between properties. They heard what sounded like children in distress on multiple occasions, crying that went on for extended periods, screaming that didn't sound like normal childhood tantrums. The kind of sounds that made them uncomfortable, that made them wonder if they should do something. But like so many people, they didn't want to interfere. They didn't want to make assumptions. They convinced themselves it probably wasn't as bad as it sounded. Maybe the kids were just having meltdowns. Maybe the parents were dealing with normal discipline issues. Maybe it was none of their business. And now they live with the regret of not acting on those concerns. They wonder if a phone call to child services, a conversation with Malaya or Daniel, any kind of intervention might have changed the outcome. They carry the weight of knowing they heard something wrong and didn't do enough about it. As the investigation progressed and investigators dug deeper into Daniel Martel's background, more troubling information emerged. Daniel had a history that raised serious red flags. He had issues with anger management. Ex-partners from previous relationships described him as controlling and sometimes aggressive. One ex-girlfriend told police that Daniel had a temper that could explode over small things, that he'd been verbally abusive, that she'd felt afraid of him at times. There was a previous incident involving child welfare concerns from a prior relationship. The details are sealed in court records, but it's clear that this wasn't the first time questions had been raised about Daniel's behavior around children. He had a pattern, a history that suggested he wasn't someone who should be trusted with the care of vulnerable kids. Malaya Brooks Murray had her own concerning history. About 2 years before Lilly and Jack disappeared, she had temporarily lost custody of them. Court documents show the children were placed with Malaya's mother, their grandmother, for several months while Malaya dealt with what the records vaguely describe as personal issues. The specifics are sealed because they involve child welfare matters, but it's clear that at some point, the system determined Malaya was not capable of safely caring for her children. Whatever was happening in her life at that time, whatever struggles she was facing, they were serious enough that a court removed Lilly and Jack from her care. When she eventually regained custody, family members expressed private concerns about whether she was truly ready to handle the responsibilities of parenting 2 young children. Her own mother, who had cared for Lilly and Jack during that period, reportedly had reservations about returning them to Malaya's care. But the legal process determined that Malaya had addressed whatever issues had led to the removal, and the children were returned to her. Financial records painted a picture of a family under tremendous stress. Daniel and Malaya were deeply in debt. Credit cards maxed out, loans they couldn't repay. They were behind on rent, facing possible eviction. They were struggling to afford basic necessities for 3 children. The financial pressure on this household was enormous. Anyone who's experienced serious financial stress knows how it affects everything. It creates tension in relationships. It makes people desperate. It can lead to terrible decisions when people feel overwhelmed and see no way out. The financial situation in the Sullivan household was a powder keg. Text messages between Daniel and Malaya, recovered from their phones during the investigation, revealed significant relationship problems. They argued frequently about money, about the children, about their future together. The messages showed resentment, particularly from Daniel, about having to support and care for children who weren't biologically his. There were discussions about how much easier life would be without certain burdens, dark conversations that take on sinister meaning in light of what happened. Messages where Daniel complained about the cost of raising Lilly and Jack, about how they complicated his relationship with Malaya, about wishing things were different. These weren't just normal venting between stressed parents. These were conversations that revealed deep resentment toward two innocent children whose only crime was existing and needing care. The last confirmed independent sighting of Lilly and Jack alive was on May 1st, the day before they were reported missing. Security cameras at a Dollarama store in a neighboring town captured the family shopping together at 2:25 inches the afternoon. The footage shows Malaya, Daniel, and all three children in the store. Lilly and Jack appear normal in the video, walking around, looking at items, behaving like typical kids on a shopping trip. That timestamp, 2:25 p.m. on May 1st, is the last time anyone outside the family can verify that Lilly and Jack were alive and okay. After that moment, only Daniel and Malaya can account for what happened to the children. From 2:25 p.m. on May 1st until 10:01 a.m. on May 2nd, when the 911 call was made, that's nearly 20 hours. 20 hours where we have to rely entirely on Daniel and Malaya's word about what happened. 20 hours where there are no independent witnesses who can verify the children were safe. 20 hours where, given all the other evidence suggesting Daniel and Malaya have been deceptive, their word isn't worth much. This is the background you need to understand. Two vulnerable children living with adults who had histories of concerning behavior. A household under extreme financial stress. Evidence of abuse that was reported but not acted upon in time. Neighbors who heard distress but didn't intervene. A family isolated on a rural property where terrible things could happen without witnesses. And then, on May 2nd, those children were suddenly gone, vanished. And the only people who could explain what happened were the same people who had every reason to want them gone. Before we continue with the timeline of what investigators believe actually happened, I want to know what's the weather like where you are today? Sunny, rainy, snowing? Drop it in the comments. I'm curious about where all of you are watching from and what conditions you're experiencing right now. Now let's piece together the timeline of that night and morning, the hours when everything changed for Lilly and Jack Sullivan. Investigators have spent 7 months piecing together what really happened during the critical hours between the afternoon of May 1st and the morning of May 2nd. Using forensic evidence, digital data, witness testimony, and financial records, they've reconstructed a timeline that tells a very different story from the one Daniel Martel and Malaya Brooks Murray have been telling. This is what the evidence shows actually occurred. But the timeline doesn't start on May 1st. It starts days earlier, with evidence of planning and preparation that suggests what happened to Lilly and Jack wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It was premeditated. A co-worker from the retail store where Malaya worked part-time came forward with information that investigators find extremely significant. This co-worker reported that on April 24th, more than a week before the children disappeared, Malaya specifically requested to have May 2nd off from work. She cited a family matter she needed to handle, something that required her to be home that day. Think about that for a moment. On April 24th, Malaya knew she would need May 2nd off. She planned for it in advance. She made sure her work schedule was clear for that specific date. Why? What family matter did she know about more than a week in advance that would require her to be home on that exact day? The most logical explanation, the one that fits with all the other evidence, is that she knew something was going to happen on May 2nd. She knew she would need that day to report the children missing and deal with the investigation that would follow. She was planning for it. This same co-worker provided another crucial piece of information. On April 29th, just 3 days before the disappearance, Malaya came to work with what appeared to be scratches on her arms. When the co-worker asked about them, Malaya said the family cat had scratched her. But the co-worker noted that the marks looked unusual, not quite like typical cat scratches, and Malaya seemed uncomfortable discussing them. She changed the subject quickly and kept her sleeves pulled down for the rest of her shift, even though the store was warm. Could these marks have been from a struggle? From a child fighting back? We can't know for certain, but the timing is notable. 3 days before Lilly and Jack disappeared, Malaya had fresh scratches on her arms that she was reluctant to explain. The internet search history from both Daniel and Malaya's phones reveals a pattern of research that suggests guilty knowledge and planning. On April 26th, 6 days before the disappearance, Malaya searched for information about cleaning products and their effectiveness. She wasn't looking at general household cleaners. She was researching specific chemicals and their properties, the kind of information someone would need if they were planning to clean up biological evidence. That same day, she searched for information about missing persons cases and how they're investigated. She was educating herself about what happens when children go missing, what procedures law enforcement follows, what investigators look for. On April 27th, Daniel's browser history shows he searched for information about forensic science and investigation techniques. He looked up evidence collection and preservation methods. He researched how long certain types of investigations typically continue before resources are scaled back. These aren't casual searches out of general interest. These are searches that demonstrate an unusual level of interest in investigative procedures just days before 2 children disappeared. On April 28th, Malaya searched for information about search and rescue operations and how they're conducted. She was learning about the response she could expect when children were reported missing. Financial records show that during this same time period, Daniel and Malaya were making specific purchases. Daniel went to a hardware store and bought various items, including tools and supplies. The store's records show the transaction. When investigators asked Daniel about these purchases, he first claimed he couldn't remember making them, then later said they must have been for projects he was planning around the property. But here's the problem with that explanation. The yard shows no signs of recent projects that would require these tools, and the items were never found on the property when police conducted their searches. So where did they go? What were they actually used for? The most logical answer is that they were used for something Daniel doesn't want to admit, and then disposed of to hide that use. The hardware store employee who processed Daniel's purchase remembered the transaction because of the combination of items and the way Daniel acted. According to this employee, Daniel seemed nervous and didn't engage in the usual small talk that often happens during checkout. He paid cash, which isn't unusual in itself, but combined with his demeanor, it stood out enough to be memorable. On April 28th, Malaya made an online purchase of cleaning supplies from a bulk supplier, not regular household cleaners from a grocery store, industrial strength products. Professional-grade items designed for heavy-duty cleaning. Large quantities, far beyond what a normal household would need for routine cleaning. The order was placed on April 28th with expedited delivery to ensure the products arrived before May 2nd. They were delivered on April 30th. When investigators asked Malaya about this purchase, she claimed she was planning to do a deep cleaning of the house. But when police arrived on May 2nd, the house wasn't deeply cleaned. So what were those industrial-strength cleaning supplies actually used for? The evidence suggests they were used to address biological evidence, to clean up blood and other traces of what happened to the children. Now let's move to the evening of May 1st, when the evidence suggests something terrible happened to Lilly and Jack. The children's electronic devices, tablets they used for games and educational content, provide crucial timeline information. Both tablets show consistent usage patterns up until the evening of May 1st. The devices were used around 7:30 to 8 p.m., consistent with the children's normal evening routines. They typically used their tablets until bedtime, playing games or watching videos. But on the evening of May 1st, the tablets show activity until approximately 8 p.m. and then nothing. Complete cessation of use. For children who normally used their devices until they went to sleep, this early stop is anomalous. What prevented them from continuing their normal patterns? The most likely explanation is that something happened to them that made it impossible for them to use their tablets anymore. The household smart home devices provide additional timeline information that's deeply disturbing. The system includes smart speakers and a smart thermostat that log various events. On the evening of May 1st, around 9:45 p.m., there was a sudden spike in noise detected by the smart speaker in the hallway near the children's rooms. The noise level was high enough to trigger the device's logging threshold, meaning it was significantly louder than normal household sounds. What caused that noise spike? Was it shouting, screaming, a struggle? The device doesn't record actual audio unless activated by a wake word, so we don't know exactly what the sounds were, but we know something loud and unusual happened at 9:45 p.m. After that noise spike, the house became unusually quiet in the areas where the children would normally be. Normal household sounds continued in other parts of the house, but there were no sounds from the children's rooms, no voices, no movement, nothing. The smart thermostat data reveals something bizarre and unexplained. On the night of May 1st, around 10 p.m., the heat was turned up significantly higher than usual. The temperature in the house was raised to approximately 82 degrees Fahrenheit and kept there for several hours before being lowered back to normal around 4 a.m. This is late spring in Nova Scotia. Outside temperatures were mild. There's no reasonable explanation for why someone would turn the heat up to 82 degrees in the middle of the night. But there is an unreasonable explanation, one that fits with the other evidence. Elevated temperatures accelerate decomposition. They also help dry out surfaces that have been cleaned, evaporating moisture more quickly. If someone was trying to address biological evidence, raising the temperature would help with that process. Cell phone data provides crucial information about movements during the critical hours. Daniel's phone shows him leaving the property around 11:15 p.m. on May 1st. This is consistent with his admitted trip to a gas station, a trip he claimed was just to buy cigarettes. But why leave the house at 11:15 at night for cigarettes? What was really happening during that trip? When Daniel returned from the gas station, his phone data shows him spending time in the area of the children's rooms around midnight. What was he doing there? The blood evidence tells us the children had already been harmed by this point. Was he cleaning, moving bodies, addressing evidence? Between 2 and 3 a.m., neighbors reported hearing sounds of heavy objects being moved inside the house, dragging sounds, thumping, the kind of noises that suggest furniture being moved or something heavy being transported. What was being moved at 2:00 inches the morning? At approximately 3 a.m., Daniel accessed the internet on his phone and conducted searches related to investigation techniques and evidence detection. In the middle of the night, while his partner and baby daughter were presumably sleeping, while 2 children were missing or dead, he was researching how investigations work. That's not the behavior of an innocent person. That's the behavior of someone trying to stay ahead of law enforcement. Around 5:30 a.m. on May 2nd, Daniel's phone shows him leaving the property again. The cell tower data and GPS information places his phone near the wooded area where the delivery driver would see his truck approximately 15 minutes later. He was in that location for about 15 to 20 minutes before the phone shows him returning to the property. This completely contradicts Daniel's claim that he was home all morning. The cell data doesn't lie. It proves he made a trip to that wooded area during the exact time window when evidence could have been disposed of. When confronted with this data, Daniel initially claimed his phone must have been malfunctioning or that the data must be wrong. But cell phone location data from multiple towers is highly reliable. The phone was in that location because Daniel was in that location. Malaya's phone data shows she remained at the property during all of Daniel's trips. Her phone didn't leave the house from the evening of May 1st through the morning, when the 911 call was made. This is consistent with her staying home while Daniel handled the disposal of evidence. But there's something interesting in Malaya's phone activity patterns. During the night of May 1st into the early morning of May 2nd, her phone shows very little activity. No texts sent, no calls made, no social media usage, no web browsing. For someone who typically used her phone frequently throughout the day and evening, checking Facebook, texting friends, scrolling through Instagram, this sudden silence is notable. What was she doing during those hours when she wasn't using her phone? Was she dealing with a situation that required her full attention and couldn't be interrupted? Was she cleaning? Was she helping Daniel move bodies? The lack of phone activity suggests she was occupied with something that prevented her from her normal patterns of device use. At 10:01 a.m. on May 2nd, Malaya called 911 to report the children missing. By that point, the evidence had been addressed. The bodies had been moved off the property. The house had been cleaned. The story had been prepared. It was time to report the children gone and begin the performance of being distraught parents whose kids had wandered off into the wilderness. The timeline that emerges from all this evidence is clear. Something happened to Lily and Jack on the evening of May 1st, around the time their tablets stopped being used and the smart speaker detected unusual noise. The children were harmed in the house, which explains the blood evidence found in their bedroom and bathroom. Daniel and Malaya spent the night addressing the evidence, cleaning the house, moving bodies to temporary locations on the property. In the early morning hours, Daniel transported the remains to the wooded area for final disposal, and then, after giving themselves enough time to ensure everything was in place, they called 911 and reported the children missing. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. This was planned, prepared for, and executed with deliberation. The evidence of premeditation is overwhelming. Beyond the major pieces of evidence we've already discussed, there are additional elements that seal this case and eliminate any remaining doubt about what happened to Lily and Jack Sullivan. A confidential informant has come forward with information that could prove crucial to the prosecution. This person had contact with either Daniel or Malaya in the weeks after the disappearance and was told things during private conversations that revealed knowledge beyond what was publicly known about the case. The identity of this informant is being protected, which is standard procedure in criminal investigations. Confidential informants often face risks if their cooperation becomes known, so law enforcement takes steps to shield their identities. What we know is that this person heard statements from one of the suspects that included specific details about the case that hadn't been released to the public. According to the informant, one of the suspects made comments that revealed knowledge of how the children died, where their bodies were initially placed, and what was done to conceal evidence. The informant didn't fully understand the significance of what they were being told at the time. The conversation seemed like venting or speculation, but after watching the case develop over months, after seeing the evidence that emerged, the informant realized that what they'd been told wasn't speculation. It was confession disguised as hypothetical discussion. The informant came forward and provided investigators with specific details that align with evidence that hasn't been made public. This corroboration between confidential testimony and physical evidence that only investigators know about is extremely powerful. It's one thing for someone to claim they were told something, it's another thing entirely when what they were told matches evidence that wasn't publicly available. The information is being carefully verified and cross-referenced with other evidence. If it continues to check out as thoroughly as it has so far, this confidential informant testimony could be one of the most crucial elements in the prosecution's case. The hardware store employee who sold Daniel the tools and supplies in late April has provided additional details about that transaction that investigators find significant. This employee has worked at the store for years and processes hundreds of transactions. Most of them blur together. But he remembered Daniel's purchase specifically because of the combination of items and Daniel's demeanor. According to the employee, Daniel bought items that, when purchased together, suggested a specific purpose: shovels, tarps, heavy-duty garbage bags, rope, bleach. Individually, these are common items that people buy for various legitimate reasons, but together, purchased by someone who would soon report his children missing, they take on sinister implications. The employee said Daniel seemed nervous during the transaction. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't engage in conversation. He seemed eager to complete the purchase and leave. When the employee tried to make small talk, asking if Daniel had a big project planned, Daniel gave a vague response and didn't elaborate. The employee remembered thinking the interaction felt off, but didn't think much more about it until investigators came asking questions months later. The cleaning supply order that Malaya placed online has been thoroughly examined by investigators. The supplier that fulfilled the order provided detailed records of exactly what was purchased. The specific products Malaya ordered are typically used by professional cleaning services or specialized companies that handle biohazard cleanup. They're not products a typical homeowner would even know to look for or know how to use properly. One of the products was an enzymatic cleaner, specifically designed to break down biological material, including blood. Another was an industrial-strength oxidizing agent used to eliminate organic stains and odors. These aren't things you'd buy for regular house cleaning. These are things you'd buy if you needed to eliminate evidence of death. The fact that Malaya knew to order these specific items suggests she researched what would be most effective for the task she was planning. The order confirmation recovered from her email account shows she paid extra for expedited delivery to ensure the products arrived before May 2nd. She needed them by a specific date. She was working on a timeline. The smart home device data provides additional details that paint a disturbing picture of what happened in that house. The smart speaker in the hallway didn't just detect the noise spike at 9:45 p.m. on May 1st. It also logged the complete absence of children's voices after that time. The device's algorithms can distinguish between adult and child voices based on pitch and frequency. In the days before May 1st, the device regularly detected children's voices throughout the day and evening. After 9:45 p.m. on May 1st, no children's voices were ever detected again. The thermostat anomaly remains one of the most bizarre and unexplained elements of the case. Investigators have consulted with forensic experts about why someone would raise the temperature to 82 degrees in the middle of the night. The consensus is that elevated temperature serves two purposes in the context of concealing evidence. First, it accelerates the drying of clean surfaces, helping to eliminate moisture that might preserve biological evidence. Second, it can accelerate early-stage decomposition, which might be relevant if bodies were being stored temporarily before disposal. There's no innocent explanation for this behavior. You don't turn your heat up to 82 degrees on a mild spring night unless you have a specific reason related to what you're trying to accomplish. And in this context, what Daniel and Malaya were trying to accomplish was hiding evidence of what they'd done to two children. When confronted with various pieces of evidence, both Daniel and Malaya have demonstrated a pattern of lying and changing their stories. When first asked about his movements on the morning of May 2nd, Daniel said he was home the entire time. When cell phone data proved he'd left the property, he claimed he'd forgotten about a quick trip to check something. When the delivery driver's testimony placed him at the wooded area, he claimed the witness must be mistaken. When shown that his phone's GPS data confirmed the location, he claimed his phone must have been malfunctioning. Each time evidence contradicts their statements, they adjust their story. But they never get ahead of the evidence. They never voluntarily provide information that investigators later verify. They only admit to things after being confronted with proof. This is classic guilty behavior, the pattern of people trying to maintain a lie while being forced to acknowledge pieces of truth as they're exposed. Malaya has shown similar patterns. When asked about the cleaning supplies, she said she'd been planning to deep clean the house. When investigators pointed out the house wasn't deeply cleaned when they arrived, she said she hadn't gotten around to it yet. When asked why she'd ordered industrial-strength products instead of regular cleaners, she claimed she'd just clicked on the first products she saw online. But the order history shows she specifically searched for and selected professional-grade items, not random products. When asked about requesting May 2nd off from work more than a week in advance, Malaya first said she didn't remember making that request. When her co-worker's testimony and the work schedule records proved she had, Malaya claimed she'd needed the day off for a doctor's appointment. But there's no record of any medical appointment scheduled for that day. The lies compound, the inconsistencies multiply, and with each contradiction, the case against Daniel Martel and Malaya Brooks-Murray becomes stronger. Investigators have built a case that doesn't rely on any single piece of evidence. It's the totality of the evidence that's overwhelming. The soil analysis, the DNA, the witness testimony, the cell phone data, the financial records, the internet searches, the smart home data, the confidential informant, the pattern of lies. Each piece supports the others. Each element corroborates the theory of what happened. This is how strong cases are built, not on speculation or assumption, but on layer after layer of evidence that all points in the same direction. And in this case, every piece of evidence points to Daniel and Malaya being responsible for the deaths of Lilly and Jack Sullivan and the concealment of their remains. The case is sealed. Justice is coming. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, what are you waiting for? This case is about to break wide open. We're on the verge of major developments in the prosecution of Daniel Martel and Malaya Brooks-Murray, and you don't want to miss what happens next. Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications so you're alerted the moment we drop updates on this case. Charges are expected within weeks. The legal proceedings are about to begin. The fight for justice for Lilly and Jack Sullivan is entering its most critical phase. You've followed the evidence this far. You've seen how strong the case is. Now stay with us as we watch justice unfold. Subscribe now. The investigation has built an overwhelming case against Daniel Martel and Malaya Brooks-Murray. 7 months of meticulous work by the RCMP and forensic experts has produced a mountain of evidence pointing to their guilt in the deaths of Lilly and Jack Sullivan. Now the question becomes, what happens next? How does this case move from investigation to prosecution to, hopefully, justice? Prosecutors with the Nova Scotia Public Prosecution Service are currently reviewing all the evidence that investigators have compiled. This is a massive undertaking. We're talking about thousands of pages of reports, forensic analyses, witness statements, digital evidence, financial records, and expert opinions. Every piece has to be carefully examined to determine how it will be presented in court, what legal standards it meets, and how it fits into the overall narrative of the case. Legal sources close to the investigation indicate that formal charges are likely to be filed within the next few weeks. The exact charges haven't been publicly announced, but legal experts believe Daniel and Malaya will face charges of first-degree murder for both children. First-degree murder in Canada requires proof of planning and deliberation, that the killing was intentional and premeditated rather than spontaneous. The evidence of premeditation in this case is substantial, Malaya requesting May 2nd off from work more than a week in advance. The internet searches about forensic investigation and cleaning products in the days before the disappearance, the purchase of specific tools and industrial cleaning supplies. The pattern of preparation suggests this wasn't a crime of passion or an accident that spiraled out of control. This was planned. Additional charges could include indignity to human remains, which addresses the disposal and concealment of the bodies, obstruction of justice for lying to investigators and attempting to mislead the investigation, potentially charges related to the abuse and neglect that preceded the deaths, though prosecutors may choose to focus on the murder charges as the most serious offenses. Legal experts who have been following this case closely believe the circumstantial evidence is strong enough to secure convictions even without the recovery of the children's remains. This is a question that comes up frequently in cases where bodies haven't been found. Can you prosecute a murder without a body? The answer is yes, absolutely, if the circumstantial evidence is compelling enough. Canada has seen successful prosecutions in no-body homicide cases before. The key is building a case where the totality of evidence makes it clear beyond a reasonable doubt that the victims are dead and that the accused are responsible. In the Sullivan case, the evidence meets that standard. The blood evidence proves the children were seriously harmed. The DNA degradation patterns suggest the biological material came from deceased individuals. The witness testimony, cell phone data, and pattern of deception all support the conclusion that Daniel and Malaya killed these children and disposed of their remains. Once charges are formally filed, Daniel and Malaya will be arrested and brought before a judge for bail hearings. In cases involving murder charges, particularly murders of children, bail is extremely unlikely to be granted. The severity of the charges, the strength of the evidence, and the risk that the accused might flee or interfere with witnesses all weigh heavily against bail being approved. Legal experts expect both Daniel and Malaya will be held in custody pending trial. They'll be housed in separate facilities, prevented from communicating with each other, which is standard procedure when co-accused might coordinate their stories or influence each other's testimony. The timeline from charges to trial in the Canadian justice system typically takes at least a year, often longer for complex cases. There are preliminary hearings where the prosecution must demonstrate they have sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. There are pre-trial motions where defense attorneys challenge evidence, seek to exclude certain testimony, and argue various legal points. There's the process of jury selection. And then finally, the trial itself, which in a case of this magnitude could last several weeks or even months. The prosecution's strategy will likely be methodical and comprehensive. They'll present the evidence in a logical sequence that builds the narrative of what happened. They'll start with establishing who Lilly and Jack were, the family situation, the concerning history of abuse and neglect. Then they'll walk the jury through the timeline of the disappearance, the initial search efforts, and the shift in focus to Daniel and Malaya as suspects. The forensic evidence will be presented through expert witnesses. Soil scientists will explain the analysis that linked the Sullivan property to potential burial sites. DNA experts will walk the jury through the blood evidence and what it proves about the children being harmed in the house. Cell phone data analysts will show Daniel's movements during the critical hours. Digital forensics experts will present the internet search history and what it reveals about planning and guilty knowledge. The delivery driver will testify about what he saw on the morning of May 2nd. Neighbors will describe what they heard. Teachers will talk about the signs of abuse they observed. Co-workers will discuss Malaya's advance planning and the scratches on her arms. The confidential informant, if their testimony is deemed admissible and reliable, will reveal what they were told in private conversations. The prosecution will paint a complete picture, using multiple types of evidence that all corroborate each other. The strength of the case is that it doesn't rely on any single piece of evidence. Even if the defense successfully challenges one or two elements, the overall case remains intact because so many independent pieces of evidence point to the same conclusion. The defense attorneys for Daniel and Malaya face an enormous challenge. Their job is to create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors, to suggest alternative explanations for the evidence, to attack the credibility of witnesses and the reliability of forensic analyses. But how do you create reasonable doubt when the evidence is this overwhelming? Defense strategies might include suggesting that the children actually did wander off into the wilderness and their bodies simply haven't been found despite extensive searches. They might argue that the blood in the house came from minor injuries that were cleaned up, not from serious harm. They might claim the cell phone data is unreliable or that Daniel's trip to the woods was for innocent purposes. They might attack the credibility of the delivery driver's identification or suggest the confidential informant is lying for personal gain. But each of these defense theories has to account for all the evidence, not just individual pieces. How do you explain the premeditation evidence if this was just children wandering off? How do you explain the DNA degradation patterns if the blood came from minor injuries? How do you explain the pattern of lies and the internet searches about investigation techniques if Daniel and Malaya are innocent? The defense will do their job, as they're required to do in our justice system. They'll challenge everything they can challenge. They'll create whatever doubt they can create. But legal observers believe the evidence in this case is strong enough to overcome those challenges and secure convictions. If convicted of first-degree murder, both Daniel Martel and Malaya Brooks Murray would face life imprisonment under Canadian law. Canada doesn't have the death penalty. The maximum sentence for first-degree murder is life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. That's the mandatory minimum sentence. The judge has no discretion to impose a lesser sentence for first-degree murder convictions. There's hope among investigators and the community that as the legal proceedings advance, either Daniel or Malaya might cooperate with authorities and reveal the location of Lilly and Jack's remains. Sometimes when defendants realize the evidence against them is overwhelming and conviction is inevitable, they choose to cooperate in exchange for considerations in sentencing or other benefits. If one of them were to come forward and lead investigators to where the children's bodies are located, it wouldn't eliminate the charges or result in freedom, but it might influence how they're perceived by the court and the public. More importantly, it would give Lilly and Jack's family the ability to properly lay them to rest, to have a place to visit and mourn, to have closure that's currently impossible without knowing where the children are. Investigators continue to hope for that cooperation. They continue to search the wooded areas where evidence suggests remains might be located. They haven't given up on finding Lilly and Jack and bringing them home. The community response to this case has been profound. Vigils have been held for Lilly and Jack in multiple locations across Nova Scotia. People who never met these children have gathered to light candles, share prayers, and demand justice. Memorials have been created with flowers, stuffed animals, and messages of love for two kids who deserved so much better than what they got. There's a determination in the community that Lilly and Jack will not be forgotten, that their deaths will mean something, that the system that failed to protect them while they were alive will at least deliver justice now that they're gone. The biological father, Cody Sullivan, has been devastated by the loss of his children. Despite his own struggles and the loss of his parental rights, he loved Lilly and Jack. He's spoken publicly about his anguish, his regret that he wasn't in a position to protect them, his anger at the people who harmed them. He's attending court proceedings and advocating for the harshest possible sentences for Daniel and Malaya. Malaya's mother, who cared for Lilly and Jack during the period when Malaya temporarily lost custody, is reportedly heartbroken and struggling with guilt. She's questioned whether she should have fought harder to keep the children, whether she should have seen warning signs, whether she could have prevented this tragedy. She's cooperating with investigators and has made it clear she supports full prosecution of her daughter if the evidence proves Malaya's guilt. The family is fractured, lives are destroyed, and at the center of it all are two children who never had a chance, who were failed by the adults who should have protected them. who deserve to grow up and have futures and experience all the things childhood should be. Justice is coming. The legal system is moving forward. And soon, Daniel Martel and Malaya Brooks Murray will face the consequences of what they've done. We've covered a lot of ground in this investigation. 7 months of evidence, hundreds of hours of forensic analysis, witness testimony that places the accused at crucial locations, digital data that contradicts their lies, scientific proof that Lilly and Jack were harmed in that house and their remains were moved to concealment locations. The evidence speaks clearly, and what it says is damning. This case represents the best of investigative work and the worst of human nature existing side by side. The RCMP investigators, who have worked tirelessly on this case, refuse to accept the easy answers. They refuse to believe the story Daniel and Malaya were telling when that story didn't match the evidence. They followed every lead, analyzed every piece of physical evidence, interviewed every potential witness, and built a case brick by brick until the truth became undeniable. The forensic scientists who analyzed soil samples and DNA evidence brought their expertise and precision to bear on questions that seemed impossible to answer. Where were the children buried? What happened to them in that house? The science provided answers when human testimony couldn't. The delivery driver who came forward with what he'd seen demonstrated the importance of ordinary citizens paying attention and speaking up when they have information that might be relevant to an investigation. He didn't have to come forward. He could have convinced himself that what he saw wasn't important, that it probably wasn't connected to the case. But he trusted his instincts and contacted police, and his testimony became a crucial piece of the puzzle. The teachers who reported their concerns about Lilly, the neighbors who came forward with information about what they'd heard, the co-workers who provided details about Malaya's behavior, all of these people contributed to building the case. Justice in cases like this requires a community effort. It requires people caring enough to get involved, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. But this case also shows us the darkest aspects of human behavior. 2 adults who were entrusted with the care of vulnerable children chose to harm them instead of protect them. They planned it. They executed it. They tried to cover it up. They lied to investigators, to the community, to the volunteers who searched for days trying to find Lilly and Jack. They allowed massive resources to be expended on searches they knew were futile because they knew the children weren't lost in the woods. The cruelty of that deception is staggering. Watching people exhaust themselves searching for children you know are dead because you killed them requires a level of callousness that's difficult to comprehend. But that's what Daniel and Malaya did. They maintained their performance of being distraught parents while knowing exactly what had happened to those kids. This case also highlights systemic failures that we need to confront. Teachers reported concerns about Lilly. Those reports went into a system that was too overwhelmed to respond quickly enough. Child protective services that might have intervened were understaffed and overburdened. The report sat in a queue while Lilly and Jack remained in danger. We have to do better. We have to fund these systems adequately so that when a teacher raises concerns about a child showing signs of abuse, someone can respond immediately. We have to create pathways for intervention that don't require waiting weeks or months for investigations to begin. Because in cases like this, time is literally the difference between life and death. Neighbors heard concerning sounds but didn't want to interfere. This is a cultural issue we need to address. We need to normalize calling for welfare checks when we hear things that concern us. We need to create communities where people look out for each other's children, where we're willing to risk being wrong or seeming nosy if it means potentially protecting a child in danger. The evidence in this case proves that even without recovering remains, justice can be served. The forensic science, the digital evidence, the witness testimony, it all combines to create a picture that's clear beyond reasonable doubt. Lilly and Jack are dead, Daniel and Malaya are responsible, and the Canadian justice system is going to hold them accountable. There's something important about that. Families of victims in cases where bodies aren't recovered often fear that justice won't be possible, that without remains there can't be prosecution. This case demonstrates that's not true. When investigators are thorough, when forensic science is applied rigorously, when witnesses come forward, justice is possible even in the most challenging circumstances. Lilly Sullivan was 6 years old. She liked drawing and playing outside. She was learning to read and was proud of her progress. She had her whole life ahead of her. Jack Sullivan was 4 years old. He loved trucks and dinosaurs. He was energetic and curious about everything. He was just beginning to understand the world around him. They deserved to grow up. They deserved to be safe in their own home. They deserved adults who would protect them and nurture them and give them the childhood every kid should have. Instead, they got Daniel Martel and Malaya Brooks Murray. And it cost them everything. But their story isn't over. Their deaths will mean something. The investigation into what happened to them has been exhaustive and thorough. The evidence that's been gathered will be presented in court. Daniel and Malaya will face trial. And if justice is served the way it should be, they'll spend the rest of their lives in prison for what they did. Lilly and Jack can't be brought back. That's the tragedy we can't undo. But we can ensure their deaths result in accountability. We can ensure the people responsible face consequences. We can ensure their story is told so that other children in similar situations might be noticed and helped before it's too late. The investigation continues. The search for remains continues. The legal proceedings are about to begin. And through it all, Lilly and Jack Sullivan will not be forgotten. Justice is coming. And it's coming for Daniel Martel and Malaya Brooks Murray. They can't hide from the evidence. They can't lie their way out of what they've done. The truth has emerged, piece by piece, through 7 months of relentless investigation, and that truth is going to put them away for the rest of their lives. Rest in peace, Lilly and Jack. You deserved so much better, but you will get justice.